In this demonstration, we're going to talk about how to view and manage file system components. Specifically, we'll go over how Device Manager and Disk Management make this possible. Let's look at Device Manager first. We go down to the Start menu, right-click, and select Device Manager. From here, let's go ahead and click the drop-down menu next to Disk Drives. This shows us a list of all the drives that are installed on this system. To see more specific information, go ahead and right-click a drive and select Properties. From here in the General tab, we can see various pieces of information regarding this drive. We see the type. This one is a hard drive. The manufacturer will be listed here in some scenarios. We can also tell that this is a regular hard drive because it doesn't have a bus number or target ID. If it did, it'd most likely be a SCSI drive. Additionally, we can see the device's current status. In this case, it's working properly. If there were any errors with the device, they'd show up here. Now there's one tab that shows up under Disk Drives in Device Manager that doesn't show up for any other device type. That's the Volumes tab. This tab gives us various pieces of information regarding the disk and the volumes contained on it. Note that you first have to select Populate for it to obtain that information. You can see those various bits of information including the partition style, capacity, disk number, and status. Down here, we also have the different volumes that are contained on this drive. Since this is our primary hard drive, this is where the C volume is. The one thing you can't do in Device Manager is manage these components. To do that, we want to use a different utility called Disk Manager. To get there, we'll close this dialog and close Device Manager as well. There are two ways to get to Disk Management. One way is to right-click on Start, open Computer Management, and then select Disk Management from the left-hand column. But it's easier to just come up here and select Disk Management in this menu. Let's maximize the window to make it easier to see. Now, Disk Management is divided into sections. The upper pane shows a listing of all the different volumes that have been defined on the system for all of our storage devices. For example, here's our C drive, E drive, and F drive. Additionally, we have some partitions that don't have letters. These are generally ones that were created by the operating system when it was installed. Down here in the lower part of the Disk Management interface, you see a geographical depiction of how the volumes have been defined on the various hard disk drives. You can see that we have one for each of the installed storage devices. We have Disk 0, Disk 1, and Disk 2. On each disk, there's a listing of the partitions that have been defined on that disk. Now I want to come over here to this part of the screen and click a particular volume, in this case, the C volume where Windows is installed. When I do, I see that the C volume is defined on Disk 0, and that it's the second partition on that drive. Notice that down at the bottom of the screen, different types of volumes are identified with different colors. For example, any black space indicates that this is unallocated space. It hasn't been allocated to any partition yet, so it's free space we could use for a new volume if we wanted to. Down here at the very end on Disk 2, we have about half a terabyte of unallocated space that we could use for a new volume. The blue partitions are primary partitions. As you can see up here on Disk 0, I have three different partitions. I have Recovery and I have my C drive. I also have an unlabeled amount of an unlabeled partition that's used for operating system functions. If you see a volume with a light green color, that indicates that a simple volume has been defined on a dynamic disk. Notice that we have two dynamic disks and one basic disk on this system. On Disk 1, we have a simple volume here that's named Stats. It's been assigned the drive letter F. We also have a simple volume down here on Disk 2, but you'll notice that there's something different. There's no volume name and there's no assigned letter. That's because this volume, while it's been defined, doesn't have a file system on it. In addition, the system also has spanned volumes. Those are indicated in purple. Up here, I have a volume called Art that's assigned a drive letter of E. But if you look down at the bottom of the display, we see that the Art volume is composed of space on two separate hard disk drives. We have about 730 gigabytes on Disk 1 and about 440 gigabytes on Disk 2. This means that Windows will use space on this drive and this drive together to form the Art volume. It'll treat the Art volume as if it were one big hard disk drive. It basically allocates space and creates a logical spanned volume from the space on these two hard disks. So if I were to save a file on my art volume, the E drive, it could be saved on disk 1, or it could end up being saved on disk 2, depending on how Windows decides to save the file. Now let's select a volume up at the top here. Right-click and select Explore. We see that we can view all the different files and folders contained within that volume. Additionally, if we select this PC, we can see all the different volumes that are accessible within Windows. Notice that we have our C drive, which is our operating system drive found on disk 0. We have Art, or the E drive, which is spanned across disk 1 and disk 2. We also have our stats for the F drive, which is found on disk 1. Also notice that the unlabeled volume doesn't show up in this list. That's because it doesn't have a drive letter or a partition. To add those, we first want to come here, right-click, and select Change Drive Letter and Paths. Okay, now click Add. Then we want to choose a drive letter. I'm going to select G and click OK. Now, if we come back to Windows Explorer, we see that it shows up. But if we try to access it, we get a message stating that we have to format the disk first on drive G before we can use it. So I'm just going to go ahead and select Format Disk. It's going to give us a few different options here. By default, it'll use the available space on the volume. It also wants us to select a file system. By default, it uses NTFS. You can alternatively use FAT32 if you wanted to. Now, you almost always use NTFS when you deal with Windows internal storage devices because it allows you to implement users and permissions on files and folders. That way you get a lot better control over your system. NTFS also allows us to create much bigger volumes with much larger files. FAT32 is a very old file system that doesn't support user and permission assignments. You can't implement access controls on it either, so there's a security issue there. It also has severe file size limitations, so really, unless you're dealing with an external flash drive on a USB port, you're probably going to use NTFS on all internal storage devices. Let's come down here and give this a volume label of data. Then click Start. It warns us that, hey, when I format this, I'm going to erase everything that's currently on this partition. Are you sure you want to do that? We say, yeah, that's fine because there's nothing there. So we select OK. We'll wait a moment and then the disk formats. In File Explorer, you see that we can now save data on our G drive. Let's open it. Notice that I can right-click and create a new folder. Then I can open it. Within that folder, right-click and empty space. Now I can create a new bitmap image. I come up here, right-click, and edit the image. We can create some beautiful artwork here, and I can save it. All because I have a file system on this volume now that allows me to create and save data. That's it for this demonstration on Windows file systems. In this demo, we talked about how to view and manage our file system components. First, we did this in Device Manager, and then we talked about how to manage file system components with disk management. We ended this demonstration by creating files and folders inside of a volume using File Explorer.